On the afternoon of August 25th, 1942, a Tuesday, a shepherd working the high ground near Dunbeath in Caithness heard engines in the fog. Low, too low, the heavy drone of something large, moving through cloud that sat against the hillside like a wall. Then the sound stopped. What followed was fire. A short Sunderland flying boat carrying 15 men to Iceland had struck the slope of Eagle's Rock at full power, breaking apart on impact and scattering wreckage across the moorland. 14 of those aboard were dead. The 15th, a tail gunner named Andrew Jack, was found hours later, burned and wandering through open country in shock, unable to explain what had gone wrong. Among the dead, in an Air Commodore's uniform, was Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of George V, the brother of the reigning king, and the father of a 7-week-old baby he had held at a christening font just days before. He was 39 years old, and the monarchy he belonged to had been quietly afraid of him for years, not because of what he had done in a cockpit over Scotland, but because of everything he had done in the drawing rooms, the private parties, and the dangerous corners of a life the palace had never been able to fully control. This is the story of the prince the royal family could not explain, from the rigid household that formed him, through the marriage designed to save him, to the wartime flight that ended him. It spans 4 decades, 3 children left fatherless, and the question that has followed the House of Windsor for more than 80 years. What was it about this man's life that made his death so impossible to leave alone? But to understand how a prince of the blood ended up on a doomed flying boat over the Scottish Highlands, how a man born into the most watched family on earth became the one whose name the palace could least afford to explain, you have to go back further than the fog and the fire and the hillside. You have to go back to the family that made him, the world that shaped him, and the particular kind of danger he carried long before the war gave him a uniform and a mission. This is the story of Prince George, Duke of Kent. From the rigid corridors of Sandringham to the wreckage at Eagle's Rock, and everything the crown could never quite bring itself to say about what lay between. He was born on the 20th of December 1902 at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, the 4th son of the man who would become King George V and Queen Mary of Teck. 4th son. That phrase matters. It meant proximity to the throne without the weight of succession, visibility without the discipline of preparation, a life lived inside the institution but never at its center. His eldest brother, David, would one day be king and then spectacularly fail at it. His second brother, Bertie, would inherit that failure and wear the crown with anxious, stammering dignity. His third brother, Henry, would disappear into military service and quiet obscurity. George occupied a different space entirely. He was the one with charm. The household he grew up in was not built for charm. George V ran his family the way he had run a naval wardroom: order, punctuality, deference, and a deep suspicion of anything that looked like self-indulgence. Queen Mary, born Victoria, Mary, Augusta, Louise, Olga, Pauline, Claudine, Agnes, matched her husband's formality with a reserve so practiced it became a kind of architecture. She loved her children in her way, which was the way of a woman trained to believe that duty was a higher language than affection. The boys were raised by nannies and tutors, educated for service, measured against expectation. Emotion was not forbidden in this household. It was simply not the currency anyone knew how to spend. George responded to this world not with rebellion, but with a kind of elegant deflection. He was handsome, genuinely, conspicuously handsome, in a family where physical grace was not evenly distributed. He was socially fluent in a way his brothers were not, comfortable at dinner tables, easy with strangers, drawn to art, music, conversation, and people who lived outside the narrow circle of court and regiment. Where Bertie was awkward and David was restless, George was polished. He could enter a room and make it feel lighter. That gift would serve him well in public. It would serve him dangerously in private. His early career followed the expected script: naval training, as was customary for royal sons, and then, in a departure that said something about both his temperament and his ambition, postings to the Foreign Office and the Home Office, making him the first member of the British royal family to work as a civil servant. That detail tends to get lost in the later mythology of scandal and glamour, but it is worth holding on to because it reveals a man who wanted competence. He wanted a function beyond ceremony. He wanted to be something more than a beautiful younger brother standing behind more important people at state occasions. That desire, to be taken seriously, to matter on his own terms, would run beneath everything that followed, shaping his choices, his marriage, and the version of himself he tried to build before the version the rumor mill built instead. You have to understand what London was in the 1920s and 30s for a young prince with that combination of looks, social ease, and appetite for movement. It was a city of clubs and country houses, of transatlantic wealth and aristocratic license, of rules that applied rigidly in public and dissolved in private. The social world George moved through was not the world of his father's court. It was Mayfair after dark, the embassy circuit, the theater, the private parties where titles mixed with money, and where the boundaries of acceptable behavior depended entirely on who was watching. For a prince of his generation, this world offered everything the palace could not: spontaneity, intimacy, freedom, risk. And risk was the word that clung to George's name long before anyone spoke it aloud. By his late 20s, his reputation in certain circles had acquired a texture that no amount of official photography could smooth over. There were stories about nightlife, about companions, about appetites that did not fit the image the monarchy needed its younger princes to project. Some of these stories were specific, some were atmospheric. All of them carried weight, because in a Britain where male same-sex acts remained criminal offenses, and where the social fabric of the upper classes depended on a gentleman's agreement not to notice what happened behind closed doors, even the rumor of deviation could become a weapon. Blackmail was not theoretical in this world. It was an industry, and a prince whose private life generated the wrong kind of attention was not merely embarrassing to his family. He was a vulnerability. The name most often attached to the dangerous chapter of George's 20s is Kiki Preston, an American socialite whose reputation for drugs and recklessness made her a fixture of the very world George found irresistible. What precisely passed between them and how far George's involvement with narcotics extended remains part of the story's contested territory. Later biographers and the pitch material for Glengowan's biography both treat Preston as central to George's reputation, while acknowledging that the evidence base is uneven. Some claims documented, others inherited from decades of biographical tradition without firm proof. What matters for the narrative is not whether every allegation is settled, but that by the early 1930s, the palace had reason to worry about the fourth son. His charm, which was genuine, had led him into rooms whose doors the institution could not control. It was into this tension, between the prince the public was beginning to admire, and the prince the palace was beginning to fear, that Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark arrived. She was born in Athens on the 13th of December, 1906, the daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, and through her mother she carried the blood and the memory of the Romanovs. That ancestry was not decorative. It was formative. Marina's childhood was shaped by the overthrow of the Greek monarchy, the exile that followed, and the years her family spent in Paris living the diminished, genteel life of displaced royalty. Still titled, still connected, but without the country that had given those titles meaning. She grew up knowing what it looked like when a dynasty lost its footing. She arrived in Britain not as a naive bride, but as a woman who understood, in her bones, that royal life could be taken away. She was beautiful in a way that photographs from the period still communicate, angular, composed, with a quality of self-possession that read as elegance rather than coldness. She spoke multiple languages. She dressed impeccably. She carried herself with the particular dignity of someone who had learned early that appearance was a form of survival, and she wanted what exile had denied her: a settled home, a functioning royal household, a life inside an institution that would not collapse beneath her. George wanted something too. He wanted the version of himself that Marina made possible, the responsible prince, the family man, the man who had put the dangerous years behind him and stepped into the light of respectability. Whether that desire was entirely sincere or partly strategic is one of the questions the story never fully resolves and does not need to. Both things can be true. A man can genuinely love the woman he marries and also understand, with painful clarity, that the marriage is the thing standing between him and ruin. On the 29th of November, 1934, they married at Westminster Abbey, followed by a Greek Orthodox ceremony at Buckingham Palace. The event was not simply a wedding, it was a production. Recent scholarship on the ceremony shows the palace, the church, and the BBC working in deliberate coordination to turn the day into a national emotional experience. Radio microphones placed to capture the ritual. Commentary designed to make listeners feel present inside the abbey. The whole apparatus of modern media deployed to sell the idea that the monarchy was a family, intimate and accessible, bound by the same love and hope that any British household understood. Millions listened. The newspapers ran photographs for days. George had been created Duke of Kent, Earl of St. Andrews, and Baron Downpatrick the month before, giving him a titled household and a public role distinct from his birth rank. The message was clear. This was a new beginning. The difficult years were over. The glamorous prince had found his match, and the crown had gained a daughter-in-law, whose beauty and poise could carry the family's image into a new era. For a time, the message held. George and Marina set up home at 3 Belgrave Square, in the heart of London's most prestigious residential district, and began building what looked, from the outside, like the most enviable branch of the Windsor family. Their first child, Edward, was born in October 1935. Their daughter, Alexandra, followed in December 1936. The household photographs from these years show exactly what the palace wanted the public to see. A handsome couple, well-dressed children, interiors that balanced royal formality with domestic warmth. George was increasingly visible in official duties, factory visits, military inspections, the diplomatic circuit, and Marina became the kind of royal wife whose clothes and bearing generated admiration without controversy. They were, by every available measure, the success story, the golden branch, the proof that a prince could be modern and magnetic without being dangerous. Beneath that surface, the architecture of George's reputation had not been demolished. It had been papered over. The stories from his 20s did not vanish because he married well. They receded into the background of a culture that preferred not to look too closely at what its princes did when the cameras were not running. The question was never whether George had been wild. The question was whether the wildness was finished or merely better concealed. And then, in December 1936, the monarchy received the answer it had been dreading, not from George, but from his eldest brother. Edward VIII's abdication was not simply a constitutional crisis. It was a detonation inside the Windsor family's understanding of itself. The king had chosen a twice-divorced American woman over the throne, and in doing so he had demonstrated in the most public and humiliating way imaginable exactly what one royal man's private desires could cost the institution. The crown passed to Bertie, who became George VI with visible reluctance and a stammer the nation would learn to love. The family closed ranks. The mood inside the palace shifted from embarrassment to something closer to institutional terror. If the monarchy could lose a king to appetite, it could not afford another prince whose private life sat outside its control. That is the hinge. Before the abdication, George's indiscretions were a family problem. Regrettable, worrying, but manageable, within the discrete machinery of royal life. After the abdication, they became something else entirely. They became existential. The crown had been burned once. It could not survive being burned again. And George, charming, beautiful, unreliable George, with his rumored lovers and his whispered associations, and his talent for finding the rooms the palace could not police, was suddenly the most dangerous man in the family. He responded, as far as the public record shows, by leaning further into seriousness. He deepened his involvement with the Royal Air Force, took on more official duties, wore the uniform with increasing conviction. In October 1938, he was announced as the next Governor-General of Australia, a role of genuine imperial weight, a posting that would have taken him and Marina to the other side of the world and given him the thing he had always wanted, a function, a purpose, a title that meant something beyond birth. It was, in a sense, the monarchy's answer to the problem of George. Send him far enough away, give him enough responsibility, and perhaps the distance would do what domesticity alone had not, make him safe. That future lasted 11 months. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and the appointment was postponed indefinitely. The prince who might have become the empire's most glamorous governor was instead kept in Britain, in uniform, inside a family whose name could no longer survive another humiliation. The escape route had closed. And the war, which would give George his finest public role, was also ticking toward the fog-bound afternoon that would end everything. The war did not simplify George. It rearranged him. In peacetime, the monarchy's problem with its fourth son had been containable, a matter of private management, social discretion, the quiet machinery of a court that had centuries of practice in keeping its own secrets. Wartime changed the calculus entirely. Censorship tightened, security scrutiny deepened. The movements of every member of the royal family acquired strategic significance, and the tolerance for private risk shrank to almost nothing. George could no longer be merely glamorous and slightly unreliable. He had to be useful. He threw himself into the role with what appears, from the available record, to have been genuine conviction. He returned to active service with the Royal Air Force, holding the rank of Air Commodore, and took on a schedule of morale visits, factory inspections, and welfare tours that sent him across the country and eventually across the Atlantic. In the summer of 1941, he traveled to Canada and the United States on an official goodwill tour, the kind of assignment that used everything he was good at: personal warmth, public presence, the ability to make a room feel that the monarchy cared. He was photographed in uniform, met officials, visited training establishments, and projected exactly the image the crown needed from its most photogenic prince: duty, resolve, the family united behind the war effort. Marina, meanwhile, held the domestic architecture together. She was at the family's country property near Iver in Buckinghamshire with the children, Edward, now 6, and Alexandra, 4, managing a household under wartime constraints while her husband moved through the official calendar. The marriage, whatever its private tensions, presented a stable surface to the world, and Marina's particular gift, the composure she had carried since her exiled childhood, was precisely what the moment required. She did not need to perform stability. She had been practicing it since she was old enough to understand that her family's Greek throne was gone. But the older stories had not gone away. They could not. Reputation, once established in the circles that mattered, does not dissolve because a man puts on a uniform. The whispers about George, his companions, his appetites, the years before Marina, remained part of the ambient knowledge of the British establishment, the kind of thing that was understood without being spoken, referenced without being confirmed. In a peacetime court, that ambient knowledge was manageable. In wartime, with the threat of enemy intelligence exploitation and the heightened sensitivity around anything that could be used for blackmail or propaganda, it was something else. It was a standing vulnerability inside the royal household. Whether the palace took specific steps to manage that vulnerability during the war years is not something the available record settles cleanly. What the record does show is a pattern familiar from other wartime royal arrangements. George was kept busy, kept visible, kept moving. His value as a morale figure was real. His risk as a private individual had not disappeared. The institution's solution, as it had been before the war, was motion. Keep him occupied, keep him purposeful, keep him in the version of himself that photographs could safely capture. There is something worth sitting with in that arrangement, a man whose family needed him to be someone he may not have entirely been, deployed into a war that gave him the best possible reason to inhabit that someone fully, while the private self, whatever its actual dimensions, remained sealed behind the institutional imperative of image. George was not the only person in wartime Britain living a double life, but he may have been the one whose double life carried the highest dynastic stakes. Through 1940 and 1941, the public George and the useful George were the same man. He flew, he visited, he represented. The Blitz had made the monarchy's visibility a matter of national morale. The king and queen stayed in London, and the extended family was expected to show itself doing its part. George did his part. He was good at it, and the photographs from these years show a man who looked, at last, like the serious figure he had always wanted to become. Leaner, older, uniformed, purposeful, the playboy softness of the 20s replaced by something that read as resolve. The private George is harder to reach. Later biographers, working from memoir, rumor, and the long biographical afterlife that attached to his name, continued to treat the war years as a period in which George's unresolved personal conflicts ran beneath the official surface like a fault line. Glenn Gowans' biographical material references allegations of ongoing same-sex relationships, blackmail exposure, and institutional anxiety about what George's private associations might cost the crown if exposed at the worst possible moment. The evidence for these specific claims varies. Some rest on biographical tradition passed down through decades of retelling. Some are supported by the testimony of contemporaries. Some remain allegation in the purest sense. Persistent, plausible, unproven. The documentary's job is not to adjudicate each claim, but to show why, in a wartime monarchy still recovering from the abdication wound, even the possibility of such exposure was enough to keep the institution awake at night. What is not in dispute is this. By the summer of 1942, George was a man living inside a set of contradictions that the war had sharpened rather than resolved. He was more publicly useful than he had ever been, and more privately complicated than the institution could afford. He was a father of 2 young children, with a third on the way. He was an air commodore whose commitment to flying had become part of his identity. He was a prince whose name still carried the residue of every rumor the 1920s and 30s had generated. And he was operating inside a family that had learned, at catastrophic cost, what happened when a royal man's private life escaped the palace's control. On the 4th of July, 1942, at the family home near Ever in Buckinghamshire, Marina gave birth to their 3rd child. They named him Michael George Charles Franklin. The name Franklin was a tribute to President Roosevelt, a gesture of wartime alliance and personal friendship that carried diplomatic as well as emotional weight. Prince Michael of Kent entered the world 7 weeks before the event that would define his entire life, though he would have no memory of it and no conscious experience of the father whose absence would shape everything that followed. There is something about that timing that resists easy narration. A baby born into a family at war, into a household held together by a mother's composure and a father's official purpose, into a name freighted with royal expectation and private complication, and the father has less than 2 months left to live. The viewer knows this. The family did not. That gap between what we know and what they knew is where the story's cruelty lives. George attended Michael's christening. It was, according to Scottish records that later compiled the Kent family's official documentation, the last formal royal event he would ever attend. A baptism, a beginning. The final ceremonial act of a father who had spent his adult life trying to become the man his family needed him to be, and who had never quite settled the question of whether he had succeeded. The weeks between Michael's birth and the end of August moved with the ordinary rhythm of wartime royal life. George continued his duties. Marina recovered. The household at Iver contained what households with newborns always contain: broken sleep, small rituals, the particular exhaustion and tenderness of a family absorbing a new life. Edward was 6. Alexandra was 5. Michael was a few weeks old. The war continued outside the windows, but inside the house, the geometry of the family had shifted in the way it always does when a child arrives. Everything reorganized around a new center of gravity. George's schedule for late August included a flight to Iceland. The mission was official, a morale and inspection tour of RAF personnel stationed there, the kind of assignment he had undertaken repeatedly during the war. The aircraft was a short Sunderland flying boat, a large, heavy, reliable machine used for long-range maritime patrol and transport. The departure point was RAF Invergordon, on the Cromarty Firth in the Scottish Highlands. The route would take them north over the Scottish coast and out across the sea to Reykjavik. There was nothing in the mission paperwork, as far as the surviving record indicates, that marked this flight as unusual. It was a wartime tour. The prince had done others. The crew was experienced. The aircraft was serviceable. The weather, however, was not cooperating. Fog and low cloud had settled across the northern Scottish coast, the kind of gray, clinging murk that reduced visibility to almost nothing and turned instrument flying from a precaution into a necessity. On the morning of Tuesday, the 25th of August, 1942, the Sunderland took off from Invergordon with 15 people aboard. George was among them. The flight plan called for a route that would take the aircraft out over the coast and northward, clearing the high ground of Caithness before reaching open sea. What happened in the minutes after departure has never been fully explained, to the satisfaction of everyone who has examined it. The aircraft did not follow its planned track. It deviated inland, flying lower than it should have been, heading toward rising ground that the crew either could not see or did not recognize in time. The board of inquiry that later examined the crash would find that the Sunderland was on a course other than the one filed in the flight plan, and at an altitude insufficient to clear the terrain ahead. The inquiry also noted that the weather conditions, while poor, should not have defeated an experienced pilot, and that the engines were under power at the moment of impact, meaning the crew had not recognized the danger, had not attempted to climb, had not known that the hillside was there until it was too late. At approximately 13:42, the aircraft struck the slope of Eagle's Rock, near Dunbeath in Caithness. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage broke apart. Fire consumed what remained. Of the 15 people aboard, 14 died, including Prince George, Duke of Kent, who was 39 years old. One man survived. Rear gunner Andrew Jack was found later, badly burned and in shock, wandering across the open moorland near the crash site. He had been thrown clear or had somehow extracted himself from the tail section and was moving through the landscape in the dazed, instinctive way of a man whose body was still trying to survive what his mind had not yet processed. He was the only witness. He was also, in the decades that followed, the detail that conspiracy theories would circle back to again and again. The one survivor, the man who might have seen something, the body that refused the clean closure of total destruction. The wreckage lay on a Scottish hillside in fog. The prince was dead. The crew was dead. The mission to Iceland would never be completed. And somewhere in Buckinghamshire, a woman with 3 children, one of them 7 weeks old, had not yet been told. The news moved through official channels with the grim efficiency that wartime had made routine. The Air Ministry confirmed the crash. The palace was informed. The king, George's brother Bertie, who had never wanted the crown and had spent the war trying to hold the country's morale together with a voice that sometimes would not cooperate, learned that afternoon that his younger brother was dead. Queen Mary, now 75, received the news at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, where she had been living since the start of the war. She had buried a husband. She had survived the abdication of one son. Now she was being told that another son had been killed on a Scottish hillside in fog. Marina was at Ivor. The details of how and when she was told have not been recorded with the precision one might expect for the widow of a prince, which is itself a kind of detail, the private moment of notification swallowed by the institutional machinery that immediately surrounded it. What is known is that she was 35 years old, that she had 3 children under the age of 7, that the youngest was not yet 2 months old, and that the husband she had married 8 years earlier in a ceremony broadcast to millions was now a body being recovered from a burning aircraft on a hillside she had never seen. Edward, the eldest child, was 6 years old. In the space between one afternoon and the next, he became the Duke of Kent. He did not choose the title. He did not understand the title. He inherited it the way children inherit everything from the adults around them, passively, completely, without consent. Alexandra was 5. She was old enough to register the change in the household, the gravity in adult faces, the absence that would not be explained, and then would be explained, and then would never be fully explained again. Michael was 7 weeks old. He would grow up knowing his father entirely through what other people told him, through photographs and official records and the accumulated mythology of a man he had no memory of touching. The formal response of the monarchy was shaped by the same forces that had shaped every public statement about George during his lifetime. The need to honor, the need to control, and the imperative to present the right version. The official announcement described the Duke of Kent as having lost his life on active service during a flight to Iceland on a special mission. That phrase, special mission, would do more work than anyone who drafted it could have anticipated. It was accurate in the narrow military sense. It was also, in the decades that followed, the crack through which every alternative explanation would enter. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 29th of August. George was buried in the royal vault. The king attended, the family gathered. The nation was informed that a prince had died for his country. The wartime context did what wartime context always does to royal death. It provided a framework of sacrifice and duty that made grief legible, respectable, containable. A prince killed on active service was a tragedy the public could understand and the monarchy could narrate. It was clean. It was noble. It was the version that worked. The version that did not work, or rather, the version that would not stay buried, began almost immediately. The Board of Inquiry's findings, when they emerged, raised questions that the official narrative of noble sacrifice could not comfortably absorb. The aircraft had been off course. It had been too low. The weather was poor, but not, the inquiry suggested, poor enough to explain the deviation. The engines had been under power at the moment of impact, meaning the crew had not been attempting an emergency landing or responding to a known crisis. They had flown into the hillside as though they did not know it was there. For a routine flight carrying routine passengers, those findings might have generated professional concern and technical review. For a flight carrying the king's brother, they generated something else entirely. The suspicion that the official story was incomplete. Who had planned the route? Why was the aircraft inland when it should have been over the sea? Was there an additional passenger whose presence on the manifest had been suppressed? Had the mission itself been something other than what the public was told? And beneath all of these specific questions, the larger one that would never fully dissolve. Was the crash an accident, or was it something the institution needed to happen? The honest answer, as far as the available evidence allows, is that the crash was almost certainly what the inquiry said it was. A navigational error in poor visibility, compounded by low altitude and high ground, resulting in a catastrophic impact that killed nearly everyone aboard. The aircraft hit a hill because it was where it should not have been, and the crew did not correct in time. That is tragedy. It is not mystery. But the reason the mystery persisted, the reason it outlived the war, outlived the witnesses, outlived the generation that knew George personally, is not really about the crash at all. It is about the man on the aircraft, a prince with a documented public reputation for glamour and a contested private reputation for everything the monarchy could not afford to acknowledge, had died in circumstances that were, at minimum, unexplained enough to support alternative readings. The crash did not create the suspicion. George's life did. The fog at Eagle's Rock simply gave the suspicion a location. Andrew Jack, the sole survivor, recovered from his injuries but never became the key witness that conspiracy theorists wanted him to be. He had been in the tail section. He had limited knowledge of what was happening in the cockpit or why the aircraft was off course. His survival was extraordinary, thrown clear of the wreckage, burned, wandering in shock across open Scottish moorland until he was found. But it did not provide the explanatory power that the unanswered questions demanded. He was the human remainder of a catastrophe, not its decoder. And the fact that he survived when everyone else, including the prince, did not become its own kind of fuel for the story's afterlife. One man lives, 14 die. The one who lives cannot explain why. The aftermath of George's death reorganized the Kent family along lines that would hold for decades. Marina, now a widow with 3 young children, and a title but no husband to anchor it, faced the particular challenge of surviving inside an institution that needed her presence but could offer her only a diminished version of what she had been promised. She was no longer half of the monarchy's most glamorous couple. She was a war widow. The shift was not merely emotional, it was structural. Her place at court, her household, her finances, her children's futures, all of these now depended on the willingness of the institution to keep the Kent family inside the circle, rather than allowing it to drift into the genteel irrelevance that overtook so many minor royal branches. She did not drift. That is the central fact of Marina's post-1942 life, and it deserves the weight of its own thread rather than a footnote to her husband's death. She remained an active, visible member of the royal family for 26 years after the crash. She took on patronages, attended state occasions, represented the crown abroad, and maintained the kind of public presence that required discipline, composure, and an unbroken willingness to inhabit a role that had been designed for two people. The palace gave her a permanent residence at Kensington Palace in the 1950s, and it was there, in apartments within the same complex that had housed minor royals and royal widows for generations, that she built the second half of her life. She never remarried, whether that was devotion, convention, or the particular arithmetic of a woman who understood that her value to the institution depended on remaining the Duke of Kent's widow rather than becoming someone else's wife, is not something the record settles. All three explanations may be true at once. The children grew into their own versions of the inheritance George had left them. Edward, the eldest, carried the dukedom through a long life of military service, public patronage, and quiet institutional loyalty. Alexandra married the Honorable Angus Ogilvy in 1963 and became one of the most active working royals of her generation, accumulating decades of charitable and ceremonial service that earned her a reputation for warmth and stamina. Michael, the baby born 7 weeks before the crash, the child who attended his own christening in his father's arms without any possibility of remembering it, pursued a military career, later moved into business consultancy and cultural diplomacy, and lived for years within the Kensington Palace orbit, close to the mother who had raised him in the permanent shadow of a man he had never known. Marina died on the 27th of August, 1968, at Kensington Palace. She was 61. The day before her funeral, George's remains were transferred from the Royal Vault at Windsor to the burial ground at Frogmore, so that they could be interred together. 26 years after the crash at Eagles Rock, the couple whose wedding had been broadcast to millions were reunited in the ground. That detail carries a weight that resists commentary. A marriage that lasted 8 years, a separation that lasted 26, and then a burial together, arranged with the quiet choreography of an institution that understood, even in death, the importance of the right image. The crash itself never stopped generating attention. In the decades that followed, George's story was revisited repeatedly by biographers, by documentary filmmakers, by the particular strand of royal history that finds its energy in the gap between what the palace says and what the public suspects. Channel 4's The Queen's Lost Uncle in 2003 explored George's life and the circumstances of his death. The Smithsonian Channel's Private Lives of the Windsors in 2019 returned to the same territory. As recently as March 2026, Channel 5 broadcast The Forgotten Prince, The Mystery of the Duke of Kent, confirming that the core narrative, handsome prince, dangerous private life, unexplained wartime death, still carries enough charge to draw an audience more than 8 decades after the aircraft hit the hillside. As of this year, the surviving members of the Kent line occupy a quieter place in royal life than the one George and Marina once commanded. The present Duke of Kent, Edward, is 90 years old. He divides his time between patronage work and support for the king, living at Wren House within the Kensington Palace complex and at a property in Oxfordshire. Princess Alexandra is 89. She is remembered on the official royal website for decades of service to Queen Elizabeth II and extensive charitable work, though she has stepped back from public duties in recent years. Prince Michael is 83. He and his wife live within the Kensington Palace orbit, and his official biography describes a career that moved from military service into consultancy, cultural relations, and the particular kind of royal adjacent public life that sustains minor branches of the family without ever placing them at its center. The geography tells part of the story. The young Kent family's life had been centered on 3 Belgrave Square, on the Buckinghamshire house where Michael was born, on the interwar world of London society and imperial ambition. The surviving Kent family's life is a Kensington Palace story. Quieter, more contained, closer to the institution's administrative heart, and further from the glittering social frontier where George had once been most alive. The contraction is not failure. It is what endurance looks like when the glamour has burned away, and what remains is duty, memory, and the particular resilience of people who learned early that a famous name is not the same thing as a safe one. Prince George was dangerous to the monarchy not because of any single act the historical record can confirm, but because he embodied the gap the institution could never afford to acknowledge. The distance between the intimate, modern, emotionally available family the Windsors wanted the public to believe in, and the unruly, complicated human reality that no amount of careful staging could permanently contain. His death did not create the mystery around him, it sealed it. The crash gave the unanswered questions a location, and the rumors a martyrology. And the decades since have proven that the combination of a beautiful prince, a contested private life, and an unexplained end is precisely the kind of story that refuses to stay buried, no matter how many times the institution that produced him tries to move on. In that sense, George was not simply the family's darkest secret because of what he may have done. He was the secret because of what the monarchy could never afford to say plainly, that the photograph and the person are not the same thing, and that the distance between them is where the real history lives. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.